I'm thrilled about this. I will say that last time we did this, we literally got the foremost Lucan scholar in the country to come and speak, and that was Sarah Harris, and she's outstanding at speaking on Lucan. So we're not the foremost Genesis scholars in the country. In fact, none of us have officially studied it beyond studying theology, studying the Bible, studying the Old Testament as a whole. But we're passionate. So hopefully it'll excite you as we step into these things. But you'll have noticed that we haven't done our reading, and that's because we're actually going to do 7 readings this morning, because we're going to do an overview of Genesis with just little snapshots to give us, to remind us of the story. But before we do, just going to do a little throw out there. Does anyone have a favorite story in Genesis? Does anyone remember the book of Genesis? Anyone that might have read it recently? Yes, Hugh. Joseph, yeah. Does anyone else love the story of Joseph? Yes, oh man, I love that. Yeah, the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Everyone seen the musical? Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Other stories people like? Yes.
That moment when Joseph says to his brothers, "That's me."
That's right. That's so good. Yeah, that is such an amazing moment, actually, when he forgives his brothers. It's an incredible story. Yeah. That's the one. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. God turned it for good. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Yeah, yeah. Derek.
I'm excited about the creation, actually. And
Yeah.
we look at it now and we think God made all of this.
Yes.
The mountains and the sea, and yeah,
It's actually amazing, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, you're a man of science and medical, and that when you discover something new and you see how amazing and complex it is, and you realize that this is out of God's mind. You know, He wanted this to be the case. He wanted these things to fit together this way. Robin.
Yes, mine's creation too. 'Cause
Yeah.
I'm on my own, and I was talking to my cat this morning, and he was looking back to me.
St. Francis of Assisi style.
And I said, God is so amazing that He created you and me and the intricacies of us all.
And what did the cat say? That's so good. Yeah, we've got 3 more, and then we might have to stop there. Yes, Nolly.
The part that it always is
yeah.
so awe-inspiring to me.
Yes.
To imagine being there.
Yeah.
And an ocean being part of it.
Totally, yeah. That's into Exodus, which is the next book, but it is. I love that moment. That's so powerful. Yes, Anna.
My favourite part is when Genesis talks about what God was doing in creation and how He chose to put the trees in the garden, knowing that we'd screw up.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He gives us these chances, even though He knows that we've got frailties. Yes, that's right. Yeah, Diane.
Oh, I like this story when Abraham sent his trusted servant or whatever to find a wife for Rebecca, and how he's kind of listening to God.
Yeah.
But happens and I'll know. And
It's wonderful.
with this man.
It's a romance story, on steroids. It's wonderful. It's absolutely, it's beautiful actually, and you get caught and swept up in it in the narrative. I was this week as I was reading it. Do you mind bringing out the whiteboard? Okay, so we're gonna do an overview of these. We're gonna have our stories read. If we could have the first one on the screen, Jim, and Hayden's gonna read that first one.
Alrighty. Our first reading is Genesis 1. Oh, is it coming up there, Jim? There we go. Starting at verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night. He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
Wonderful. That's the beginning of the first section of Genesis. It's one that many of us know or have heard, and perhaps even some bits we could recite. It's the beginning of all things. Genesis itself means beginning. The whole story of Genesis, actually, from the end of creation right through to the end of Joseph, is 50 chapters in Genesis, and it covers over 2,000 years of history. Isn't that amazing? And it kind of gets crammed into this space. So really, you're getting snapshots anyway of people's lives, and you see those sort of things. And sometimes it drills down, and you kind of pause for a moment. Particularly the Joseph story, we get, that's a short amount of time, but that gets a lot of chapters. And so we're journeying through into this story. But the first thing we get is the creation of the world, that God is creating it, and it is beautiful. And it says, the next it says, and God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. Isn't that amazing? I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, good's quite a low word, really, for the universe. Yeah? Are you with me? It's like, it's good. And then it says, and there was evening and morning the second day. And then he does the creation of the third day. And then God saw that it was good. This is what begins Genesis, is goodness and joy and expression of delight. That's where it begins, with goodness. But unfortunately, by chapter 3, things change. Okay? And this is the Genesis, not just of the creation of the world, but of the source of evil and everything. And so we're going to have chapter 3 from Tim.
This is a bit sad. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You must not touch it, or you will die." "You will certainly not die," the serpent said to the woman. "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good from evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees in the garden.
This is the destruction that enters in at this point. There's 4 key movements in the first part of Genesis. We've got here Genesis 1 to 11. It gets called the primeval history. That's not evil as in wrong. It's kind of ancient. And then you get chapters 12 to 50, which we'll come to in a moment, which has 4 key characters. This helps you kind of understand the way that this is set up. And what happens is we've had creation, and then we have what was called, or what gets called, the fall. The fall is a little bit of a kind term, I think, because it kind of sets up that perhaps there was a mistake. I fell. Yeah? It's not really a fall when it's to do with choice, yes? It really should be called the plunge. Do you know what I mean? We've chosen to do this. All of us choose that God creates the universe, and he gives us an option to receive his blessing, to receive his knowledge and goodness, or to try and grasp it ourselves. And what happens is humanity grasp it themselves. And so begins a spiral of pain and destruction. It starts working out in the relationships between them. They start feeling like they need to hide because of shame. And it works its way out that in the second generation, they murder one another. And then it goes even further. And there's chaos in the cities. And God grieves that he even made humanity by chapter 6. That's the flood story. There with the ark and Noah and the animals, which we tend to kind of have a nice little cuddly picture in our heads, but it's not a nice cuddly picture moment, folks. There's so much destruction going on that God gives us a chance to start again. Okay, and then what happens is, unfortunately, the start again doesn't get any better. We think that maybe that Noah's going to be the hope, but Noah's life ends in despair and shame again. And we end up where we always end up, which is Babel. Or Babel, and this is chapter 11. It says, now the whole world had one language. Oh, this is the next one, Jim. Genesis 11. And a common speech as people moved eastward. They found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. They're trying to grasp the blessing for themselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth. It goes on a little bit more, and then we get to verse 8. And the Lord scatters them from there over the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. And that is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. Can you hear that kind of babble of sound? The Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So what we see happening already by this point is that God gives goodness, and humans choose to grasp power themselves. But then what happens is God gives grace. Okay, so God gives grace, a chance to start again. You see this play out from Adam and Eve. What happens is they choose to disobey God, and what happens is there's a consequence for that. But then it's followed by a blessing. When you read the text, you'll see that. Okay, the same thing happens with Cain. He kills his brother, and there is a consequence for that. But then God gives him a blessing. Do we feel that's a little bit weird? It is a bit weird. That, in our system, we think if somebody does a murder, then they don't get a blessing. But God lets the consequence happen. He doesn't rule out the consequence of it, but then he gives a blessing. The same thing with the flood. There's absolute brokenness and terrified, but he then, after the consequence of that, he gives a blessing. That's where the rainbow in the sky image comes from. And then in Babel, what happens is there is utter selfishness and brokenness. They're trying to grasp things for themselves. It leads to spiraling, and more. The nations are in despair, and God lets the consequence of that happen. They get scattered. But then he gives a blessing. He starts again, and this is chapter 12.
This is the story of Abram. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing."
Thanks. Do you see how he's going to bless all nations of the earth? You see how he's blessing what has just been happened? When we mess up, what we see in Genesis is that God, of course, lets the consequences happen, but then he gives us grace. He comes back and does that again. He also chooses a single person, right? He chooses a person to work from person to person. Abraham and his wife Sarah, and then their kids, and then their kids, and then the grandkids, and then there's a bunch of grandkids. Sorry for my drawings. And we head down there. But there's this moment where God gives his promise that he's going to bless all nations through Abraham's child. But Abraham doesn't have a child yet, and it takes a long time. He tries to grasp it for himself, yeah? They try to make things work for himself instead of waiting for God's blessing. And so finally he gets Isaac, okay? But even then, God puts this little plan in place to see if Abraham will really trust him. And it's actually a terrifying story. But we're going to have that read out now from Tim. This is Abraham with his child Isaac following to see if they will trust in God.
Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son.
Thanks, Tim. So we see the four characters in the second half, and each time what happens is that they stumble and fall, and God keeps blessing them. And we get Isaac, his son, and then there's trouble in that family, and part of that kind of centers on Jacob, who's Isaac's second son, and if there is a prototype of someone who tries to steal things for himself, it's Jacob, but God keeps blessing him. And there's this really interesting moment where he's had a previous moment where he's been on his own at night and he's met with God and he's seen a vision of angels descending up on the throne. But then there's another time where he's all in a funk and he's all really worried and he's anxious and he's trying to, he's got fear of his brother. He's willing actually to sacrifice all of his stuff to save his own skin. But there he has this moment where he wrestles with a man in the night, all through the night. Turns out it's going to be God. In a second we discover that's who it is. But this man is wrestling with him because Jacob's trying to grasp things. He says, when the man saw, the man saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him there. The last key story, the last key character, which we mentioned already here, is Joseph with the amazing Technicolor coat. And he has a really interesting life because he's an arrogant little kid. And he gets this flash coat and he flashes in front of all of his brothers. He gets these dreams of where he's going to end up and this kind of glory that he's going to be in and this power that he's going to have. And unwisely, he tells his brothers. And they conjure up this hate for him, so much so that they cast him into a pit for him to die. Genesis doesn't hold back from gruesome, violent stuff. It's all in there. And down in the pit, God is with him. But then they decide that actually, we could actually earn some money off this. So they sell him off as a slave so that they can earn money off his death. It's actually disgusting. Anyway, the story ends up through lots of changes. Please go and read it. It is so exciting. But at the end, what happens is Joseph ends up in a place of power, in a place of influence. In fact, actually, he's the second most powerful man in the known world. And his brothers come to him, and he forgives them. But then when their father dies, they get all nervous again that Joseph's going to take it out on them. But then Joseph has this moment.
Oh. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong things we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they have committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of the God of your father." When the message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them.
Did you catch the bit? It said that you intended it for harm, but God intended it for good. That is what Genesis is all about. God's goodness, humanity's muck, and God's goodness. Yeah? There is no other gospel There's no other good news about you earning your love of God or earning your righteousness or earning your goodness. It has to be received, not taken. Turn to the person next to you and say something that stood out from the story of Genesis. Turn to the person next to you. And then you hand. Is it always on? I just hand to Tim at the end of yours. Yeah. I ran out of time for JEPD. I'll have to do it on. Yeah. Doesn't it? Yeah.
Alrighty. Sounds like there's some good stuff. Now, before we jump into these four characters, I just want to give us a bit of an insight as to how to read Genesis. Just a few tools. And the first one I want to mention is that the fact that we have Genesis now with all its chapters and verses is actually a recent addition to it. And originally it was one continuous scroll of one big story. And so the editors of Genesis needed a way to link the story together. And the way they would do that is using repetition of words and repetition of themes. So when you're reading it this week, because you're all going to do that, eh? Yeah, absolutely. Pay attention to that and bring any of them that you spot to Soul Lab. So I'm going to give you one example just to highlight it for you. So as we read in our reading, we saw in the Garden of Eden in chapter 3 that Eve saw that the fruit looked good, saw it was desirable, and took it. Looked like a blessing, smelled like a blessing. Was it a blessing? No, it was not a blessing. Later on, when Abraham is in the presence of Pharaoh, he lies and he says, oh, that lady Sarah is actually my sister. Pharaoh looks at her, sees she's desirable, and takes her. And there is curse that follows. Later on, Lot and Abraham are having a moment where they're having a bit of a scuffle over land. And Abraham, trusting that God will provide for him, says to Lot, you pick the land, I'll go somewhere else. Lot looks up, he sees the land of the Jordan, sees it's desirable, and takes it. And that is where Sodom and Gomorrah is. And so there's this pattern that the editors are using of using the same phrasing, the exact same language, to draw attention to your mind to go, oh, something about blessing is happening here, whether it's good or bad. Does that make sense? So pay attention to that as you're reading it and bring it up at Soul Lab. I'm going to hand over to Tim now. Here you go, Tim. Thanks. Oh, you're jumping straight in, aren't you?
One way to think about Genesis is to use the metaphor of our river, the Wanganui River, which starts as a trickle somewhere on the side of Mount Tongariro and then builds power and strength and then discharges itself into the Tasman Sea. So there's all sorts of little rivulets and tributaries that flow in, and as we looked at Genesis, there's any number of these we could have sort of followed out of our own readiness to be distracted and natural curiosity. Who were the Nephilim? What's Judah and Tamar all about? And we would have loved to have spent time looking at Noah and all sorts of other things. Did people really live to 800 years old? Now, they may be some of the questions you bring to us on Wednesday night, and if so, we'll be sweating on that particular occasion because we may not know the answers. But the main flow of the river is basically centered on a number of key characters, the first of whom is God. So we're going to do a character study on God in Genesis, and Caleb's going to lead that. Secondly, we're going to look at Adam and Eve, and then we're going to look at Abraham, and I'll take us through that. And then finally, Hayden is going to look at Jacob and Joseph to get us to the end, the point where the river flows out into the Tasman. So strap yourselves in, make yourselves comfortable, and away we go.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Great. So when we look at characters in literature, there's three ways that are really, three kind of tools that I find helpful to look at a character to discover what the character is like. You can do this when you're reading a book, or I find this helpful. My background is as an actor, and so when I'm trying to figure out what the character is that I'm playing, there's three things that you look at. The first thing you look at is what do other people or other characters say about them? Yeah? So what do they say about them? The second is, what does the narrator say about them or describe about them? And then the third is, which I find the most helpful, is what do they say and do? Yeah? And out of that, you kind of get their traits, or you understand a little bit more about them. I find this with Mr. Darcy and Jane Austen. Yes, in Pride and Prejudice? Anyone like Pride and Prejudice? Not enough hands, I'm just saying. I love that, and it's a character study. And through the book, you're trying to figure out who this Mr. Darcy is. Other people talk about him. In fact, there's rumors about him before you even meet him. And even when he does some stuff, what happens is then it causes some other rumors, and people talk about him, and they misunderstand who he is. Right, but you hear what other people say, but that's not always clear. Then you get the narrator. Jane Austen describes Mr. Darcy and what he looks like and how he speaks, and that's alluring to most of us. And we get, that's enticing. But then the real key thing is what he does and what he says. But even at the beginning, what he does and he says, you start to piece together a misconception of who Mr. Darcy is. Yeah, and not until the end. Spoiler alert: if you haven't read it, it's 200 years old. It's your fault. He ends up with Mrs. Bennet, with Elizabeth. It's wonderful. And that's because you suddenly see him in his whole character. So the same thing can be applied to our characters that we're looking at here, and I want to apply that to God. So what do people say about God? What do other characters say about God in the text? Well, it's interesting. The first character who talks about God is the snake. Okay? He says God knows something that he's hiding from you, and he's not trustworthy. The second people who speak about God or say something about God's character is Adam and Eve, who say, oh, we're afraid of you, so we hid. The third character who speaks about God is Cain, right? After he's killed his brother, and he says, your punishment of me is too harsh, right? You have to be careful when you're trying to pick up a picture of a character, because the other characters all have agendas. But this is because it's a text that we've been given. God has given us a story in Genesis. It's a true story, and we'll unpack some more of what that actually really means on Wednesday. But it's a story. It's not a whole list of facts. It's a story because then you can enter into it, and you can experience it and feel it, and you can connect to it. Yes? So if you have a moment where you feel like God's punishing you too much, actually that might not be that God is. It might just be that you're feeling like Cain, and you're feeling guilty. Or that actually you feel far away from God, and actually it's because you're hiding from him. Because like Adam and Eve, you're in shame. This is a story to help you see what humanity is like. What does the narrator say about God? Well, the narrator almost says nothing about God in Genesis. He describes what God does and says, but I'll come to that in my third point. But there's in fact, there are no straight descriptions of God's character in Genesis. Not like there is in the Psalms, for example. Psalm 103 says, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Or in like Romans 8 in the New Testament, for example, it says that neither height nor depth, nor angels nor demons, nor nothing can separate you from the love that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Those are facts about God's character. You don't get that in Genesis. You just get the story. And the story tells you this. What do we see God doing and saying? We see him right from the beginning creating, bringing joy, bringing delight and beauty, goodness. He brings order out of chaos. And he's not rigid. You don't see that he's rigid. He creates things that create things. And whenever people do things wrong, he responds. He's actually constantly responding. And there's a beautiful a situation where Abraham and God have a conversation, and God changes his mind. Have you ever thought about that? That God will change his mind if you talk to him? God's not some rigid, distant God. He's one that comes down. That's another thing that I find fascinating when you look at God in Genesis, is he comes down really close. Do you know that bit that we read out from Genesis 3? God comes to walk with them and talk with them in the cool of the evening. Have you ever thought about God wants to come and chat with you? In fact, he's very chatty in Genesis. Yeah? That bit where Cain is about to kill his brother, God comes up and goes, hey, mate, what's going on? Watch out. If you keep doing what you're doing, it's not going to go well. And Cain chats back to him. My brother's keeper, back off. Let me go do my murdering. That's what it's like. But it's chat. God comes close. I don't know if you ever thought about God coming close to you or chatting to you, that you can talk back to him. That's what Genesis talks about. What I love about Genesis is that we see right at the beginning in chapter 1, which we've said a number of times here, that God saw that it was. He celebrates. God's a party God. Okay, but he's a celebrating God, not in the ways of the other gods in the ancient world. The other gods in the ancient world also party, but they party for their own sensual pleasure. And they do it, and they create scum, which is humans, and slaves, which are humans. But in Genesis, what we get is God creates humans to share life with, to celebrate with, to love, to give grace and blessing. That's what we see God as. The last thing I want to highlight about this, just in this short character survey, is that when we read in the English, we see that it talks about God lots. In fact, actually, there's 400 times it mentions the name God in 1,500 verses. So it's pretty regular that God is involved in this. But in the Hebrew, God has actually got multiple different names. Again, we'll unpack some more of that on Wednesday about what that tells us about the text. But the most regular name that gets used is a name called Elohim, which is using the name El, which is the name for God in the ancient Near East. Okay? Elohim is the name, or El Elyon gets used for Melchizedek, which means God Most High. There's a beautiful moment when Rahab is left on her own with Ishmael, and Ishmael is crying, and God sees and hears. And so God gets given a new name, which is called El Roy, which means you are the God who sees. God sees you. Isn't that a beautiful thing to learn about God? He sees you, Karen. He sees you, Kevin. He sees me. Isn't that amazing? He's El Shaddai. He's all-sufficient. He gets called that. The other name that gets used a lot in there is Yahweh. And that's because that's actually God's name. Now, the characters don't know that yet because that gets revealed in Exodus chapter 3, which is the next book in the Bible. Spoiler alert. But Yahweh is his name, which means I am that I am. Or I will be what I will be. The sense of he's sufficient, all-encompassing. That's what he is. That's what we learn about God in this. But the other thing that you notice when you read through Genesis is that you don't get a complete picture of God. A bit like you don't get a complete picture of Mr. Darcy in the first few chapters. Okay? Because this is book 1. Yeah? It's not supposed to be seen on its own. It's part of a bigger story. So we get a glimpse into God, but we see him clearer the more we see of him.
As well. So we now move to Adam and Eve. When I mentioned to Jill, my wife, that I was tasked to do a character study on Adam and Eve, her response was, what do we know about their characters? And that's a very fair question. The answer is, there are a few clues. There are a few clues. That God created Adam and Eve to lead the establishment of the human race. As we were given the task, we all were given the task through them of discovering and developing God's creation, which in fact we're still doing. But to do it in fellowship with God. They were created distinct, male and female, but equal. Adam recognized that God had given him a helpmate with whom he could function in full partnership, spiritually, in friendship and companionship, an intellectual equal, and to him, a beautiful female human worthy of his love and devotion. They were meant for each other. We often speculate that Adam and Eve were probably the perfect man and the perfect woman. I don't know whether they were or not, but for each other, they were right. They would not compete with one another, but rather complement each other with their personalities, their abilities, their temperaments, dovetailing together just as much as their bodies did. Sadly, the fall, or the plunge, and we'll come back to that in a minute, drag men and women relationships in a different direction. When the Lord says in Genesis 3:16, your husband will lord it over you, he's neither ordaining nor condoning self-serving male dominance in marriage. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul returns Christian marriage to a pre-fall ideal. In particular, this is seen when Paul tells the Ephesian church, husbands, go all out in your love for your wives, exactly as Christ did for the church. A love marked by giving, not getting. So dominating male leadership in marriage is quite clearly not a biblical concept. It is so sad that so many ancient and even current cultures have contorted marriage so badly out of shape. A lot of the marriages I've observed in my life, you'll find actually it's the wife who's the most outgoing or curious or what's the word I'm looking for here? Be careful, Timothy. Might be the more outgoing and adventurous member of the partnership. And that's as it's meant to be in that partnership. In this case, was Eve more curious, the more exploratory member of this particular partnership, while Adam was more content simply to get on with his work? I wonder. Once God placed them in the garden, they were so innocent and captivated by their closeness to God, their environment and their God-given tasks, they simply neither noticed nor cared that they were unclothed. And you have to assume, obviously, that the temperature was fairly consistent. But they just didn't, it just wasn't a thing. Most important, and as a sign of the beauty of God's love and respect for humanity, he gave them free will. They were not to be dumb automatons or unquestioning slaves. How can anyone really relate to a robot? Relationships only have meaning if each party is free to choose how to respond to the other. So Adam and Eve can choose either to continue in obedient fellowship with God or to seek to be in exclusive control themselves. Last week's sermon brought to us by Avish on spiritual warfare, especially in the reference to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, are at the very heart of Adam and Eve's journey from close fellowship with God to their sad expulsion from the garden. Eve is initially seduced by the serpent through her eyes. It looks delicious. Her flesh, the sensuous attraction of delicious food, and how many of us struggle with that. And her pride. Eating this fruit will make her and Adam equal with God. And as we know, Adam goes along with the scheme. They were tempted, yes, but that's actually not the point of the fall. They could have walked away right up to the stage where Eve took the fruit off the tree, which she was told not to do, and sunk her teeth into it. Temptation is inevitable. We're all tempted. Jesus was tempted. Of itself, it's not to be confused with willful acts of disobedience. Giving in is. When Jesus included the petition, lead us not into temptation, in the Lord's Prayer, I suggest it's not a request to ensure that we're never tempted, but that we're not tempted beyond our strength. 1 Corinthians 13, which is a verse that I have to say is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 13 is a verse that saved my bacon on more occasions I care to remember, tells us that no temptation has overtaken us that is not common to all of us. But God is faithful. He will not let us be tempted beyond what we can bear, but when we are tempted, he'll provide the way out that we can endure it. Temptation is part of life. Sin, sadly, is our own choice. So once Adam and Eve actively disobey God, they know they're no longer innocent. They see they're naked, and for some reason, they're deeply embarrassed. They blame other people. Eve blames the snake. Adam blames Eve for what they've done. They then have to be confronted, as Caleb points out, with the consequences of their bad choice and consequently live a much diminished life. Their relationship with God is forever changed. They can still communicate, but in a much more restrained way, and only because God still keeps reaching out to them. Nonetheless, an irremovable barrier, willful disobedience, has now come up between God and the pinnacle of his creation, us. C.S. Lewis said this about Adam and Eve. They wanted, as we say, to call their souls their own. But that means to live a lie, for our souls, in fact, are not our own. They wanted some corner of the universe that they could say to God, "This is our business, not yours." But there is no such corner. They wanted to be nouns, but they were, and eternally must be, mere objectives. Adam and Eve. So now we move to, I think, my favourite biblical character, Abraham. He's a true pioneer in every sense. He had no church, nor any form of fellowship to support him, no religious structure, no rules about God to follow. They were to come 500 years later with Moses. He had no home group, no prayer partner. He had none of the supporting infrastructure that we all rely upon to walk with God, without which we couldn't function as believers. Imagine. And yet he followed a voice, just a voice for the longest time, no physical presence until later in the story, that told him to leave his family home, that he would inherit a whole land which he could never have afforded to buy or indeed even to conquer, and that many nations, including kings, would come from his lineage, notwithstanding the fact that his beloved wife Sarah was, to all intents and purposes, infertile. How would we react to someone these days whose wife was in all likelihood beyond her years of childbearing, say in 70s or 80s? You know, an old couple like, dare I say it, Jill and I, announcing that we're going to have a baby. And not only that, that baby will be a key individual in the fulfillment of God's purposes. You'd all look at us like we were nuts, and quite rightly so, because in the natural order that God created, such things simply don't happen. But as Paul points out in Romans chapter 4, Abraham believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. His life story is amazing, but this piece is not intended to be a biography, but a character study. So you all have read Genesis, and you've read the stories of God's interactions with Abraham, and they're wonderful. I love them. If you haven't, just read that, and you'll be inspired, I promise. But let's look at his character. So we see in his dealings with his nephew Lot that he was naturally fair-minded, giving as he did Lot the option to choose the better land, as Hayden pointed out. Secondly, his integrity is borne out by his determination not to take advantage of the king of Sodom, after he, Abraham, in his efforts to support Lot, had won a key military campaign on that king's behalf. Rather, Abraham instead chose to pay homage to a character called Melchizedek, the king of Salem, later to become Jerusalem, and priest of the Most High God, by paying 1/10 of the spoils he'd gained from that campaign. These incidents, plus Abraham's earnest pleadings with God to save Lot and his family from the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, show his strong sense of responsibility as Lot's uncle, mentor, and friend. So Abraham is at heart what we would call a good guy. But on the other hand, he shows he can be both weak and deceptive. Weak in that he allows himself, notwithstanding God's promises, to be talked into sleeping with Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, in order to have a son, which duly happens. And finally, on 2 occasions, out of fear that he might be killed and Sarah abducted, he lies both to Pharaoh and later to a king by the name of Abimelech, saying that Sarah is his sister, which in fact she was, his half-sister, but Abraham does it out of fear that he'll be killed in order that Sarah could be abducted. So he's, like all of us, he's a mixed bag of good and bad. So why do I relate so strongly to this guy? Well, it's because that he demonstrates that in moments when he's on his own, in fact, his whole life he's on his own, he's prepared to hear and obey God. And while we all depend so much on each other in our walk with faith, there are times in all our lives where God draws us aside alone and asks us some very big questions. For me, that was very much around the time of my conversion at the age of 18, because I didn't really want to become a Christian, because that would mean that I'd lose a lot of friends, and it looked to me at the time as if I'd stop having a lot of fun that I thought was very important to have. But it just became clearer and clearer to me that the whole story about God and Jesus was actually true. And I faced a choice, and it felt like a very lonely choice of either in arrogance and defiance continuing on one direction, or in submission following God. And that's true of all of us. All of us will have these times, and not just once in our lives, but at many different occasions where it's on our own that we make the very big decisions of our lives. And Abraham is the father of all of us who by faith respond to the call of God in those lonely moments. There's a song that I heard at the age of 6 called The Reverend Mr. Black by the Kingston Trio. Does anybody remember The Reverend Mr. Black by the Kingston Trio? A few old hands are going up. It stayed with me. And the chorus goes, and I'm not going to sing it, but it says, you've got to walk that lonesome valley. You've got to walk it by yourself. Nobody else can walk it for you. You've got to walk it by yourself. And when I was 18 and I was walking up and down Queen Street, running errands for a law firm, deciding which way I was going to go, that song just bubbled up into the top of my mind. You've got to walk that lonesome valley. So I thank God for Abraham. I thank God that a man alone heard God's voice, responded to us in faith, and is the father of all who believe.
Righty. Now, you guys have been sitting for way too long, so quick, everyone up. Great, just stretch out one arm. Yeah, stretch out the other. Give the people next to you a high five. Great, and take a seat again. Brilliant. Good. Alrighty, you guys can take a seat again. It's all good. Just getting you stretched. Cool. Thanks, Tim, for that. That was good. We're going to now start looking at the story of Jacob. But before we do, I just need to clarify 2 definitions of what blessing means that we've seen so far. Okay? The first one, as Caleb was talking about at the start, was that the initial definition of blessing was to be fruitful and multiply. We see that in Genesis 1. It's abundance, it's goodness, it's fruitfulness. And God has made us a world that gets recreated and goes on and on and on. It's good. It's good. The second thing is that God then out of that chooses humans out of all the animals and says, I want to partner with you and I want to make you into my image so that you can become the steward of this blessing. And that's the second blessing. It's this kind of right to rule with God. So those are the 2 blessings. So we've got abundance and we've got ruling, birthright, stewardship. Okay? Are we good at this part, though? No, we suck at it, right? So Adam and Eve fail. Noah has his failure. And then God chooses Abraham and says, I'm going to choose you and your family and make you a vehicle of this blessing for the rest of the world. But even Abraham just struggles at this. And you've got to reach a point where you go, why is God choosing to partner with humans? Maybe he's choosing the wrong people? Does he need a better hiring process? It's ridiculous at this point. And now we get 2 more generations down from Abraham and we encounter Jacob, who is just so much worse than his grandfather. He's a shocker, as we're about to learn. But our first mentioning of Jacob that we get is actually from Rebekah, who God says to her, you've got 2 sons in your womb, and the younger one, Jacob, is going to be the one that I'm going to give both of those blessings to. But Jacob comes out of that womb embodying a total lack of trust in God's promise. He comes out grabbing the heel of his brother Esau as if trying to overtake him and take that blessing for himself. Because traditionally, those 2 blessings would go to the oldest child. Jacob's name actually means deceiver. We haven't heard that word before since the snake, which is called the deceiver, who grabs the heel. And it's an apt name for Jacob because he goes on in the story to lie, to deceive, and to scheme his way and to take the blessing that God was wanting to give him freely in the first place. He goes on, as the story continues, he goes on and he schemes his way to the birthright, that ruling blessing out of his brother Esau for a bowl of soup. And then he goes on to deceive his father out of the Eden blessing, the abundance blessing, by dressing up like his brother Esau. Notice how the right thing that God wants to happen is happening, but for entirely the wrong reasons. Yeah, that's right. So, what's the name? Hang on. Oh yeah, so this is actually an excellent example of, at the end of Genesis where we saw where Joseph says to his brothers, though you planned it for evil, God was able to plan it for good. Yeah, so all the scheming is happening, but still what God is wanting done gets done. But Jacob does not get away with the scheming. It doesn't come without consequences, is what Caleb was talking about. And this leads to hatred between him and his brother Esau to the point where he's exiled for 20 years out of his home country. And he encounters his uncle Laban, and Jacob meets his match. This dude is just as much of a schemer as Jacob. Laban manages to scam 14 years of free labor out of Jacob. But it's a scheming war because Jacob then starts manipulating the fertility of Laban's flocks to make Jacob's flocks look better and more healthy while his ones suffer and get weak. And it just bubbles up and reaches a point where it's so destructive. Laban says, you know what, I'm sick of this. Get out of here. Leave. And so Jacob is forced to go back and be in a place where he has to confront his brother again. But something happens on the way home. He encounters God and he wrestles him. And he wrestles him so hard that God has to, the wording is, strike him in the hollow of his thighs such that the hip pops out. That's only one possible place that could be. It's a crotch shot. And notice how after this moment, God strikes, I don't think that's actually a coincidence that it's that place. Remember that the definition that we've seen so far of what a blessing is to be fruitful and multiply. And that Jacob is so intent on getting the blessing for himself that God strikes him in the one place where he can generate his own blessing. And notice after this point, he has no more kids. Benjamin, who comes a bit later in the story, is probably already born at this point. I don't want you guys to miss this. So Jacob is so intent on taking the blessing for himself. He misunderstands God. He thinks he is not good. He lives in scarcity. He has no trust for him. It gets to a point where God just has to wrestle with this guy and struggle with this guy to get him to accept the blessing that he was wanting to give freely all along. But Jacob does not get it. And so God changes his name to Israel. We've already encountered the word El. What does El mean? God, right? Israel means struggles with. So his name changes to struggles with God. And that is the name of the nation that God chooses to partner with. People who he's wanting to bless freely and openly, but they just don't get it. And they have it in their mind that they have to keep fighting for themselves. I actually find this a deeply encouraging story because we're just as stubborn as Jacob, eh? We misunderstand God, we don't think he's good, and we don't trust him. But what God does not do is abandon Jacob despite all his mess. He continues to pursue him, he continues to partner with him and bless him. It's encouraging news, especially for someone as stubborn as me. We're going to change gears now, and we're going to, the story shifts at about chapter 32, and it starts looking at Jacob's sons, and particularly it hones in on Joseph. And we have a bit of a problem because Jacob is showing a lot of favoritism to Joseph. He's given him a special robe to say, you know what, this kid's the special one. He's one of the youngest ones at the time. What it does is it leads to his brothers hating his guts. They hate him. They have no peace with him whatsoever. And then to compound the issue, Joseph has two dreams. The first one is of hay bales bowing down to him. It's like he's becoming the ruler of the land. And then he has a dream of the whole universe bowing down to him. This is image of God imagery happening here. And then in his naive teenage state, he goes to his brothers and says, yo, what do you think this means? And understandably, they decide, actually, I want to kill you because you think you're going to be the one ruling over us. And so what happens is Joseph leaves one day to go into a field, and his brothers take the opportunity. They strip him of the robe that says he's important, they throw him into a pit, and then they traffic him, sell him as a slave to traders who take him down to Egypt. So he's been deceived by his brothers. And while he's in Egypt, he's then deceived again by his slave master's wife. And he is thrown down into the pit of pits, in prison, in exile in Egypt. And so we have this scenario where Joseph is pretty sure that God is telling him that he will be lifted up into a place where he's honored and in a place of power, full of blessing. And yet what he sees doesn't match up with that at all. He's in a place of utter despair and in the pit. And yet he's able to, in that place, we hear that God is with him. While he's in the pit, he becomes known as a dream interpreter. And one day, 10 years later, he's been in this pit. Pharaoh, who in the eyes of the culture at the time was viewed as a god, has two dreams, just like Joseph had two dreams. And he's brought up out of this pit, and Pharaoh asks him, I hear you can interpret dreams. And quite boldly, Joseph says, nah, I actually can't do that, but God can. That's a bold thing to say to the man who thinks he's a god, and shows the immense trust that Joseph has in the God that he serves. He then goes on to interpret the dreams correctly, and then Pharaoh looks at him and says, you are filled with the Spirit of God. Where else am I going to find such wisdom and discernment? Now, we haven't actually encountered those three things for most of Genesis. The last time we encountered that was all the way back in Genesis 1 to 3. In the tree of knowledge, of knowing good and evil, Adam and Eve were faced with a choice. Do I trust God to teach me, to guide me, to make me wise and discerning leaders in the image of God, or do I not trust that he's good enough and I have to take that for myself? Here in Joseph, we have someone finally who is filled with the Spirit, has this wisdom and discernment because he has chosen to trust God instead. And as a result, he's elevated out of this place of the pit, up into the second place in all of Egypt. He's given a signet ring which says, you are the image of Pharaoh. He's becoming this new Adam, this image of God. And at this point, his brothers come because there's now mass starvation and famine in the land. And he is able to, in the place that he is, be a vehicle of blessing that saves God's people from starvation. And when the brothers, as we read in our reading, come to him and are afraid that he's going to lash back at it for what they did, he's able to say very confidently, due to his trust in God, you meant this for evil, but God was able to plan this for good. And that's where the story of Genesis ends. But it's still not great, because you'll notice now we're no longer in the promised land. We're now in Egypt. We're in exile. And so the story must continue in Exodus. I hope this has been really helpful. It's been a lot of content. It's like drinking from a fire hose, these sessions. So I encourage you, with all the questions that you've got buzzing in your mind, come on Wednesday to Soul Lab. We're going to have a fantastic time diving into this stuff more and more deeply. It's good. Thanks, guys.